welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm really happy to welcome onto the podcast, Missy Lahren. Missy, thank you so much for making time for us.
My pleasure.
And so for folks who don't know you already, you are the chair of the board of directors at the Earth Law Center, and you wear many hats, lawyer, producer, writer, educator, and you got your PhD from the same place as me, the California Institute of Integral Studies. And so definitely a pretty special community. And you've really done some amazing work. A lot of the people on the podcast are strictly in the world of academia. So really excited to talk to somebody who's out there, not to minimize academia, they're doing really impactful work, especially at the intersection of law, environment, and then using filmmaking as a way to get that kind of message out. So to start with, though, I always like to hear people's kind of origin story. Like, how did you get into this work? And because it's a lot to engage with environmental issues during such a critical point in Earth's history and human evolution. And so how did you find your way into the world of environmental law and concern with intersection of law, environment, and also philosophy and science?
Well, I grew up in a very ordinary town in upstate New York, outside of Buffalo, actually. And I had one of those lovely childhoods where you play with your best friend, you're outside in the forest every day, you know, traipse through ditches, you swim in lakes, you might get bit by a snapping turtle. I grew up in the snow belt, so we would, the blizzard of 77 was literally one of the happiest weeks of my entire life. And then my dad was a university professor,
Mm.
and you get the opportunity to take sabbaticals. And the first time he took a sabbatical was to Northern Africa. And so for the first time, I saw how many, people suffer in other parts of the world that I didn't know anything about. And I was pretty young back then,
Mm.
when we were there, fourth and fifth grade.
Mm.
And then he took another sabbatical when I was in high school,
Mm.
and we moved to the Philippines. And that was also very eye-opening, culturally very different, because Algeria in Northern Africa had, you know, it was it went through a transformative time, a revolutionary period in its life. And interestingly, so did the Philippines.
Mm.
They had, a transition from Marcos to a, a democracy, essentially. But when we were in the Philippines for the first time, I went underwater and I started scuba diving when I was about 15 or 16 years old.
Wow.
And I would say that single-handedly changed my life.
Mm.
And while we were there, in the period between high school and college, I literally saw the reefs disappear in front of my very eyes.
Wow.
And so I think that was what inspired me to go into environmental protection, especially at the intersection of human and environmental rights.
Right. That's powerful. Yeah, sometimes people just kind of fall into this work in college because they took an interesting class, but that kind of firsthand experience of environmental degradation, that's really powerful. Well, and then so how did you find your way into law from that? Because I mean, you could have just been, I'm going to do conservation biology or something like that. So why law?
I was a bachelor's science undergrad, and I went straight to law school right from undergrad, and I
Mm.
focused on international environmental law right away. And I knew from the second I started law school that I would be going into public interest work. And I've done it ever since. I basically, direct from law school, moved out to the Bay Area, took the bar, and there's no real jobs back then for environmental activists. And so I put up my own shingle and just started doing Clean Water Act citizen suits and affiliated myself with a few other lawyers in the Bay Area that were doing the same thing. And we sort of built this heroic little community of public interest pro bono lawyers, and 30 years later, I'm still doing that same thing.
That's great. I mean, that's such important work, and I mean such pioneering work, really, because yeah, it wasn't really a thing. And even still today, I think when you say rights of nature, people are like, "Wait, what exactly are you talking about?" So I wonder if you could say a little about that, because it is a really new idea, at least in terms of actual practice. And places like Ecuador and Bolivia had really monumental changes, but this has all been in recent decades. So
Mm.
what is rights of nature about? Oh, I got to say also, a piece came out about you and your work just like a few hours ago in NBC Bay Area, and the author, Joe Rosado Jr., had a great opening line. If Mother Nature is the sergeant at arms of the forest world, then Missy Lahren might just be head of its legal branch.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
yeah, that was a great line. So yeah, rights of nature. What's this about?
So, okay, so keep in mind that when I started my legal career, rights of nature didn't exist. It hadn't started yet. You know, a lot of the initiative, the philosophy behind it started with Thomas Berry. But so my environmental career was enforcing our current environmental statutes, like the Clean Water Act, or the Endangered Species Act. And in my early career, it was actually hard to win a case.
Hmm.
we were, it was really difficult. We worked really long hours, and we could only collect a fee actually if we won our case and then submitted a fee motion to the judge. And so after about 10 years of trying to enforce environmental laws in the Bay Area, where for the most part we were quite successful, inevitably you kind of burn out. And I actually pivoted into education for
Hmm.
a stretch in there. And I went back full swing into environmental protection and activism after I got my PhD in philosophy. So, and it was really through my PhD research work that I myself learned about the rights of nature movement.
Hmm.
And it was through, taking a really careful look at Thomas Berry and his ideas around earth jurisprudence. And I wrote about the Earth Law Center in my dissertation. And then they actually recruited me to be on their board. And so, as a rights of nature lawyer, this is a new field for me, and it's definitely a steep learning curve. But I will say that the movement really started in Ecuador in 2008 when, they passed in an amazing, turn of events, after a lot of work, a constitutional, I mean, really, they changed their constitution to protect nature, but it took a long time for the judges and the lawyers to be able to really come out with some amazing decisions. And those amazing decisions just came out in 2021. And that was right about the time when I defended my PhD.
Hmm.
And so, it was just almost fate that those wins came out just as I was publishing, because it was like a magic carpet ride for me into the movement. So,
That's great. A magic carpet ride. And so, a little about your PhD is also worth noting, because I mean, of course, this is the Forum on Religion and Ecology podcast, and so that is very much rooted in Thomas Berry's work, and so your work in at CIS and the Philosophy, Cosmology, Consciousness program very much oriented around Thomas Berry, and obviously Thomas Berry and his collaboration with Brian Swim. And so, what was the stuff you were doing there? I know a little bit about it, but love to hear more.
well, it was really exciting for me to focus on Earth Day, actually.
Hmm.
um, and ironically, I'm here in Dallas to celebrate Earth Day. It was exciting because it was the 50-year anniversary of Earth Day. And I thought to myself, all right, where have we come? Where do we start? Where have we come? And so I focused on that for my dissertation. And I took a close look at Thomas Berry, Brian Swim, and Joanna Macy's work. And something exciting happened in California. they were the first state in the country to essentially mandate environmental literacy K through 12. But the curriculum that the Environmental Protection Agency built was really science based. It
Mm,
didn't have any activism, any philosophy. Um, and it also didn't have like our most inspiring science about
mm,
the intelligence of the different kingdoms of life. And so I thought to myself, you know what? If I want to activate students, I want to build like a version of this, which I found to be so innovative, but a 2.0 version. And so that's what I did. I wrote a supplement to what the state had already built, and I focused on middle school.
mm. I
And
wonder, at
yeah,
the middle school age, like, how do you communicate some of these kind of complicated ideas? I mean, talking about like intelligence and nature, I'm always interested in kind of the developmental psychology of education. It's like, well, how do you explain climate change to like a 5-year-old, or how do you talk about cosmology to like a 10-year-old? And so middle school is an interesting time because, middle school students pretty smart, but these are also kind of big ideas.
I know. And, I was advised to focus on that age group by
Mm,
Brian and some other educators actually in the Bay Area. And it's an interesting time because, you know, some people say that that door to the imagination and creativity often closes around fourth grade.
mm,
And so I thought, all right, I'll focus on keeping that door wide open.
mm,
And I'll learn the latest and greatest in brain science, and I'll go to the innovative learning conferences, which are held down at the Nueva School in San Mateo. And so I went to those for about 15 years,
wow.
learning all that I could from seasoned educators. And simultaneous with getting my PhD, I also got my master's in integral education. So I I worked with a lot of teachers that actually teach Maria Montessori's work.
Mm,
And so her curriculums are actually quite solid, beginning with kindergarten in the cosmic story. And so it wasn't that hard to like build off of that and bring them into the modern era, really.
mm,
And the other thing that gave me a little bit of an advantage is I'm the parent of two Gen Z children,
mm.
and they're kind of a unique demographic. And so I use them and their own journey to help fashion a curriculum that I thought would inspire their peers.
That's great. Great to have your own kind of test subjects to work on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I didn't realize until I think reading Thomas Berry, 'cause he refers to Montessori, and I didn't realize how cosmological that was. So were you
I
adding much else to it? What, to tweak it, to modernize it?
well, I actually studied like took a hard look at the scientific studies of intelligence related to the five kingdoms of life. And reading those studies is really hard. I actually needed the help of a friend of mine who's an evolutionary biology student at Harvard. And I said, Maya, can you please help me dissect these scientific studies? They're so technical. And so she would summarize them for me. And I was able to drop in that science, like as we studied animals and plants and slime molds and bacteria. So I made it fun. And I also, wove in everything that I could from indigenous wisdom traditions, ceremony, ritual. And what I thought I would build is the equivalent of a Martin Luther King curriculum, but do it for Earth Day. Because a lot of schools suspend programming on MLK's, you know, Earth Day in order to offer something new and different and to inspire. And so I thought I'll do the same thing. So this will be a 1 day, you know, breakfast to end of the day where it's all about the earth.
That's great. I would like to take that class. Never too old for a middle school class, especially something that really is focusing on keeping the imagination connected to the natural world and facilitating the experience of wonder and especially with the idea of intelligence. I think It's like I haven't seen one paper in the last 20 years that said, it turns out nature's dumber than we thought. It's like they're all saying the opposite. Like, oh, okay, especially in the modern Western society, we've vastly underestimated the intelligence in nature. And now study after study after study is confirming that. And not just animals, but like you're saying, slime molds, bacteria, like everything's pretty smart.
And keep in mind, the kingdoms of life were capturing the imagination of the entire planet because of COVID. And
Right.
so, for the first time, we had our microscopes out. Literally, everybody on the planet was thinking about, you know, single-celled organisms.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, it's funny how much that's like, well, it's bad news generally that there's a global pandemic, but also it attuned people to the natural world and opened up that kind of space. And in so many other ways too, even everybody who's making sourdough all of a sudden, and they're thinking, okay,
That's
here's
right.
how you really work with sourdough, and you have to be on the bread's time. The bread's not going to be on your time. And
That's right.
yeah, yeah, that's a good upshot of COVID. Not bad to try and recover some of the good news that came with all that bad news.
And another thing happened to help my dissertation along too. It was that, a lot of Gen Z suffers from what they call nature deficit disorder. And for those, year and a half or 2 years, they were out, kids were outside a lot, outside in living classrooms. And
Mhm.
so that was also something I wanted to introduce in this curriculum. So it became a lot easier to sell that idea.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah. At that point, people are like, "Oh, we definitely need this. It's pretty clear." Yeah, and hopefully we have more of that happening across the curriculum for all ages, really. I know at my university, University of San Francisco, there's some faculty who are working to try and get some eco-literacy course as a core curriculum. And not just have it as an option for the environmental studies students. Like, no, this is something everybody should be connecting to, and part of that has to be some kind of nature immersion or some kind of direct experience of the natural world, not just reading about it in books.
Exactly.
Well, that's great. Do you know how widely it's been adopted so far?
Well, I thought that was going to be my career when I graduated.
Right.
I didn't know I was going to become an earth lawyer, like literally overnight. So I haven't really peddled it around. I piloted it with some seventh graders and I taught them my systems theory lesson. And I basically taught them Brian's ideas of collapse and immersion, collapse and emergence, collapse and emergence. And I used Brian's famous story of the shrew. And I piloted it with, seventh grade girls. And I loved their reaction. And so it's very ripe to go out into the field. Um, uh, Jessica or Jessie, who's a friend of mine who teaches at the Ridge and Valley Charter School, which is really based on Thomas Berry's ideas in many ways. She's been working there for 20 years. Um, Helped me to, I mean, she invited me out there to go talk to teachers and see how much of it could actually drop into classrooms there. And so that invitation is out there, and I hope to build those lessons out when I have time or pay somebody to build them out for me.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's a good problem to have where you have too many possibilities and you're like, oh, whoops, okay, I guess the education thing will be on the sidelines for a little bit, put that on the back burner, and then environmental law came calling. Well, one thing we haven't talked about so far in law and education, filmmaking is somehow also another thing that's calling you. Like, how do you have time for all these different lives that you're leading?
Oh
So how
my
did you get
gosh.
into filmmaking?
100% Joanna Macy. So I took her great turning class, and um, some of my colleagues who Max and Theo from CIAS, we ended up working on a project together where we basically chronicled in this, like 60-minute documentary that we made while we were all students together getting our masters about the transition to 100% renewable energy. And I worked as a writer on that project. And it was just fun because um, we were really the first to tell the story, and it was a really hopeful, inspiring story. And since then, I've made with a team a couple other very short films, and then today we premiered my fifth little film here at EarthX, and this is also just an inspiring, hopeful documentary short.
Yeah, and I'm very lucky that I got to watch it before talking with you today. And yeah, very hopeful, inspiring, also just beautiful, beautiful imagery and poignant at the same time. Because you're seeing some environmental destruction, especially from logging, and so part of this is it's called Last Stand: Saving the Elwha River's Legacy Forests. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the context for that, and because I guess saving the forests is also part of saving the watershed, and it kind of started with saving the river itself. We're trying to restore the river.
Well, let me just backtrack to say, remember how we talked about the rights of nature movement really originating in Ecuador in 2008?
Right.
We did not see a massive turning point in the movement until three rivers were basically given rights of nature all within the same year in India, in Colombia, and in New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really rivers that captured the heart and the imagination of people on our planet. And so when there was an opportunity to tell the story of the Elwha River, which is up in the Olympic Peninsula, I jumped at it because really the goal of the film is to protect legacy forests. But we had this amazing fact pattern where there was a river involved, there's charismatic species, there's the return of salmon, which are keystone species.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got to make a movie about interconnection.
Mm-hmm.
We really got to make a movie about Thomas Berry's ideas. And best of all, we got to tell one of what I think is the most compelling stories right now of our generation. And that's the story of rewilding and regeneration. Because in that movie, we tell the story about how the only two dams on the river were removed. It was the largest dam removal in US history. Those dams have been on the river for 100 years. What was like 400,000 salmon that were coming up the river annually went down to about 3,000.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of those dams was at the 5 mile mark of the river, and there were no fish ladders. And so basically, those dams obliterated the ecosystem. So when the federal government said, all right, we're going to spend 325 million, we're going to take down those dams, we're going to restore that river, it's the most amazing story. And Wild Hope went out there, filmed the story. It got thousands and thousands of views. And then it came to my attention that the state was logging their legacy forest right along the banks of the river. And we realized we needed to make a sequel that's basically resaving the Elwha.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what this story is.
Yeah, so strange to me. It's such an interesting story because it seems like, oh, okay, the state's really interested in protecting the river. So I'm sure they're also protecting the forests. Like save the river, save the forests. Like, oh no, apparently not. They were interested in restoring the river. And then they're like, you know what, we can make a lot of money from these forests. I'm like, well, that's just seems such contradictory logic. And I know some of this was actually happening like while the film was in production too. Like the legal process was in motion, and so some of the forests have been protected now.
Well, it's an interesting story because, Washington, the state, was given about 1.7 million acres by the federal government when it became a state to manage. And so back in those days, that was all old ancient forest on that land. And so the state went through and logged it. And what has since grown and replaced it is now 80 to 100 years old. And so those forests are what are called legacy forests. But what's amazing about them is all the genetic heritage of those original trees and plants and understory and overstory remained in the soil.
Mm,
industrial logging practices weren't used. And so what grew back basically feel like old growth when you're in them. And
mm,
so there's so much biodiversity, and they're an amazing carbon, drawdown solution. But what the state did is they went through and made another pass, and they basically logged 96% of all those legacy forests. And this amazing lawyer on our staff, Elizabeth Dunn, since I became chair, she's been coming to me saying, we have to do something about legacy forests in Washington. Please, it's urgent. And, when she told me about this case on the Elwha River, I thought to myself, here's the case with the right facts where we can go into the courtroom and we can really, highlight this campaign. And the facts were so airtight, we thought we would win under the State Environmental Policy Act, and we were shocked. I was shocked when the judge didn't grant our injunction. And so while the case is making its way through the court, that forest was sold and it was about to be logged imminently within days. And so I commissioned the creation of an impact film to shed light on the campaign urgently. And on about the eighth day of filming the movie, the documentary impact film, the state changed their mind and said, all right, we're going to we're going to take that forest off the chopping block. And in fact, we're going to save 69 of those 126 acres permanently. So we haven't won the fight in that, there's still those acres out there that we have to find a solution for how to preserve them permanently. And there's also a total of 850 along the river up there. So
right, yeah.
yeah, the film's job is to save, resave the Elwha, basically.
Yeah, and I think it makes a pretty compelling case for it, especially, I mean, the voices that are represented in the film, it really is coming at it from like the science or the people who live there and just love the beauty or indigenous elders. You have this great mix of perspectives that make it so patently clear that, of course, we have to save it. And good news that a little has been saved. Do you know why the state changed its mind from saying no, we're not going to save any of it, and saying okay, we'll save a little?
I have a hunch.
Hmm.
My hunch is that Hillary Franz, who runs the Department of Natural Resources, she's the commissioner, is actually running for Congress.
Hmm.
And
Interesting.
so I think, why not have a win-win solution up there on the Elwha? And I really do credit the fact that the state did protect those acres, and I would call on them to extend those protections to the remaining 850 and even take a look at that last little 4% left of legacy forest in the state and come up with a long-term solution.
Yeah, that's great. And hopefully the film kind of wakes more people up so there's more public pressure to do so. But I guess even if the public wants it, ultimately it does come down to some kind of legal action. So I'd like this kind of one-two punch of filmmaking to kind of raise awareness, and then law to kind of be like, look, the public wants it, make it happen.
I know, and that's the amazing power of media.
Hmm.
Sometimes it polarizes us, but it also mobilizes us. And so, we just posted the film on YouTube today. We hope people watch it and share it. It's 20 minutes long, and find a way to get involved in the campaign of legacy forests generally. Like, find out where the legacy forest lives that's near you and see if it's under threat. And I have a feeling it is.
Yeah, sadly, yeah, that's true. There's not a lot of forests that are very well protected right now. And yeah, I like the idea that people, whether they're close to Washington or not, wherever you are, find your forests or the rivers for that matter, and try to get involved with protection. Need more guardianship.
Exactly. And today on stage here in Texas, our lawyer, Elizabeth Dunn, made the case for why a Texan should care about the forests in the Pacific Northwest.
Hmm.
And, the expert in the film talks about they're some of the most rare and unique forests in the world. with some of the highest carbon drawdown of any forest in the world, the coastal temperate rainforest. And so they're a carbon solution, not only for the US to meet our own climate targets, um, but also for the state of Washington, which has very aggressive climate targets. So we need them.
Mhm.
We need them to stay intact.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And I know too many people are really excited about like planting trees as a way to draw down carbon. Like, well, but really young new growth doesn't really pull down carbon that well. But some of our older growth really absorbs a tremendous amount of carbon. So protecting what we have is so crucial. And planting new trees, I'm not against that at all. But people often forget, like, well, we don't necessarily just have to keep planting. We can protect what we already have. And especially in Washington, as like you're saying, it's like this is some of the most impressive drawdown that you're going to get from a forest in the United States.
Exactly. And I will say that one of the exciting things about premiering the film here at EarthX, which is meant to be a bipartisan conference, is I wanted to see what kind of response the film would get because there's not a big difference between environmentalists and conservationists.
Mm-hmm.
Environmentalists tend not to have the money, but conservationists do. And so let's take a look at what type of philanthropy is out there for conservation of forests. And there's actually quite a lot of it. Most people don't realize that President Trump signed the Trillion Tree campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And so he did that by executive order. And so there is bipartisan support to restore our forests. The United States used to be 50% covered in forest.
That is crazy to think.
So
Wow. Yeah, I really appreciate any kind of bipartisan solution and try to emphasize it so much. And, I grew up in Texas and I'm living in the Bay Area. And so it's one of those things like I come from a pretty conservative background and now I'm living in a very progressive place. And so I can see it's like we have more in common than we have different. And we all need trees. We need an habitable earth. And it turns out most people agree with that. And if you can just message it in the right way, then like you're saying, media doesn't have to be polarizing; it can be mobilizing. You're like, look, we can all do this together.
mhm.
And something like even the Trump administration was doing some pro-environmental things. I think quietly because he didn't want the word getting out that would like ruin his reputation. And like, no, it's we all want this. These are all things we need. And whether you're doing it for the climate or you're doing it for national pride, there's so many reasons to care for our environment, care for our forests.
And speaking of national pride, I just want to do a shout out actually to Tilly Walton.
Hmm.
She's one of the executive producers of our film, and I really admire something that she did. She put a GoPro on her head and produced a 10-part PBS series called Wild Rivers with Tilly, where she goes down the rivers in our country and shows the beings that they are, their aliveness. And I was so swept into the stories that she was telling. And I actually called her for the blue. And I said, Tilly, how about making a film about the Elwha? And she agreed. And she was actually going to make a movie to accompany our campaign, but there wasn't enough water because of the drought for her to bring a boat down it. And
Wow.
so we ultimately didn't get to make that episode, but we did end up making the impact film that you saw today.
Right. Amazing. Well, I'll have to check out that series. I like that idea. Just put a GoPro on your head and make it happen. How devastating that the drought is that severe to where you can't get a boat going down the river.
And yeah, so let's talk about a little bit about the human health and right to drinking water.
Mm.
Um, the residents of Port Angeles, which is right at the mouth of the river, there's about 20,000 residents. They depend entirely on the Elwha for their drinking
Mm.
water. But what happens with industrial forestry practices is it disturbs the hydrology of the area, it disturbs summer stream flows. And so that's one of the grounds that we had to bring our case against the state of Washington, is that they weren't considering things like that when they allow these um, logging to proceed. And, you know, the parcels that they were going to log actually had streams
Mm,
running through them that weren't on the state's maps.
mm.
And the judge didn't consider when he denied the injunction. And so it is really important to look at drought and the impacts of logging on human health in addition to the ecosystems.
Such a great example of interdependence and learn to think in that kind of systems view. Like this is all much more connected than might meet the eye initially, and especially the interconnectedness between humans and the environment. People, still I find people who think that, well, if you're going to help the environment, that's going to hurt humans. If you want to help humans, you have to hurt the environment. No, not at all. We need a mutually enhancing relationship between humans and the Earth community. So great to be able to point that out, because I think once you bring human health into it, then even people who don't care about the environment at all, they're like, oh, right, this is about us. It's not just about the Earth.
Exactly.
Well, one other thing I want to talk about was that you're in a hotel currently, and when I was first talking to you about doing an interview, I just assumed you're in the Bay Area because you've been out here for a long time. That's where I first met you, and then you said something like, "Wait, are we talking about California time or Texas time?" I was like, "Oh, you're in Texas." And so I was like, "Oh, are you coming back to the Bay soon?" You said, "Not really." So I wonder if you could share a little bit about what happened that drove you out of San Francisco.
Well, I will say that I lived in the Presidio National Park for 25 years and recently built a house, actually powered on renewable energy, a
Mm.
very sustainable house. Really proud to have really invested in construction that I felt was the most sustainable out there. And uh, like many people in our world, I am the victim of a climate disaster. There was an atmospheric river that came through the Bay Area in December and January of 2023, and it damaged my house, and it's uninhabitable. um, and so those repairs will take quite a while, maybe a year or two. And so I'm on the
Mm.
road.
Wow, that is just insane. And I get it because I was here when those atmospheric rivers were hitting, and there was the weird like good news. At least we get rain. But it's like this is too much, and which of course is what climate scientists have been warning about for so long. They're like we're going to be in cycles of droughts and floods and droughts and floods. We'll never get normal rainfall, and those atmospheric rivers were so intense. So the important thing is you're safe, and that the repairs are underway, uh, and and also so bittersweet that it's like it's good that you're safe, but you're repairing something that was already such an ideal home, with the best construction and renewable energy, and in a beautiful part. I mean, the Presidio is just such a beautiful area. So you've been basically dealing with homelessness now for over a year.
Mhm.
Wow. Well, I really appreciate that in that year you're still doing all this tremendous work because I don't know what I would do under that kind of circumstance. But that takes a lot of emotional resilience, I would say, to have a crisis hit you pretty directly, and you're like, okay, well, I'm still going to do the work, and we're out there protecting the earth and raising awareness, all while just living out of a suitcase.
You know, it actually, in some ways, is a blessing because it gave me a hall pass to go to Climate Week and go to Davos and go to the conventions on biological diversity and the Impact 5 conference and things that I might not have given myself permission to go to. Um,
That's a
because,
really good
yeah,
attitude.
I mean, when you travel, there's a carbon impact that I'm actually really sensitive to. And so I never really allowed myself to participate in so many conferences and travel for work. But this year, and next year will be different.
Right. Yeah, I'm the same way about travel. Like, you really feel it when you're traveling and you're aware of climate breakdown. You're like, oh, I don't want to contribute to that. But in a situation like this, you're like, well, might as well, because you don't really have a stable place to stay. So get out there and connect with other people.
Learn as much as I can.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. So, what else is going on for you soon? Is there an event with RFK Jr.?
Oh, yes, he'll be here. He'll be
Ah,
here in about 45 minutes.
okay, great.
So he'll be at EarthX. And the interesting thing, uh, we have a little bit of a background because my first job as a lawyer, I represented San Francisco Baykeeper as a pro bono Clean Water Act lawyer. And Baykeeper started in San Francisco with Mike Kurz. And RFK was chairman of the board of Waterkeeper Alliance back when I was their lawyer.
Hmm.
And small worlds that there is. Mike Kurz's son, the former San Francisco Baykeeper Dan, is the director of our film.
Hmm. That is
So,
crazy. Yeah, I've heard some people say it's not a small world, it's a big family. And I think that's a good example of that. What an interesting connection. How funny. Yeah, and RFK, another good example of somebody who's really not easily mapped in terms of left and right, and complicated and often controversial figure. But I know plenty of people who are excited about the kind of energy that he's able to bring to some of these issues.
and he was a brilliant director of Waterkeeper. I'd say they're one of the most effective organizations that I've ever come across in my career. So
Oh,
it's really
interesting.
an honor
I wonder if
to
you could
go
say
to be one of their lawyers.
what exactly makes it so effective? Advice for everybody out there: how to be effective.
Well, Beekeeper enforces the Clean Water Act, and it was an exciting time to do that in federal court. You know, it's a federal law, and so you enforce it in federal court. And in the Bay Area, the cases that I was involved in, 9 military bases closed around San Francisco Bay. And so there are a lot of Clean Water Act implications.
Mm,
So one of my cases was Treasure Island, another was the Presidio. And in the case of Treasure Island, we sued the Navy and forced them to clean up. In the case of the Presidio, we took a different approach and we partnered with the Army. And over a 20-year period, I actually represented the Sierra Club on a board that watchdogged that cleanup and transition of the Presidio because it became a national park. And over those 20 years, we were able to clean up the park to the highest cleanup standard for human health and the environment of any military base in the world, and basically develop best management practices around that and prove that it could be done. And the living proof of it is Crissy Field. You know, that used to be filled with barbed wire and, buildings
mm.
and hazardous waste disposed in the sand. And now it's a restored wetland.
Wow. How amazing. And to see that happening firsthand, that's got to be so incredible.
It's incredible. And like I was saying, the story of the Elwha River is an amazing story of regeneration. So is Crissy Field.
Yeah. That's so great. I think when people hear these stories or see them portrayed in film or media, you start to realize the regenerative capacities of the planet are tremendous. And if we can just facilitate that and kind of get out of the way a little bit with our industrial growth society, and then the Earth is ready to heal.
It is. And we do have the ingenuity.
Yeah, right. We have all
And
the ideas we need. We have the ingenuity. It's just a question of doing it.
mhm.
That's great.
And
I had
like
no idea.
Brian, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Crissy Field. I've been there. Had no idea that that was part of its history.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. And it used to also be a runway, basically.
Oh,
That's how it got its name originally.
oh, okay. How interesting. That's great. Now, this is all really exciting. It's exciting work. What were you going to
Thank
say
you.
something about Brian?
Oh, I was going to talk a little bit about really the evolution of consciousness
Mm,
and the evolution of Homo, Homo sapiens. When I was working on my master's in education, one of my mentors, Bill Gang, who founded my integral education program,
mm.
he coined the term eco sapien. And I will say, I feel like this conference is a conference of eco sapiens. It's Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, but we're all really committed to the evolution of consciousness here and what our human potential is, and on behalf of the earth. So it is really exciting to be here.
I like that a lot. Eco sapien. Like something new is emerging. We need a new word for it. This isn't the Homo sapiens of, I mean, especially we're in the Anthropocene, right? It's like something new is happening. This isn't the Pleistocene. It's not the Holocene anymore, and a new human seems to be emerging. And especially great to see that it's so nonpartisan or bipartisan. It's like this bringing people together around such a common cause.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. It must be exciting to be there. I haven't been back to Dallas in a long time. That sounds like a great event.
I hope to be invited back.
Right, yeah. Well, I guess along those lines, I better let you go because you got more networking to do, and especially with RFK showing up, and really exciting. We'll have to have you back on the podcast another time because you just have amazing stories, and especially stories of regeneration and hope. We definitely need more of those out there.
Well, I'd love to come back. Next time I come back, I'll tell you the stories about those charismatic orcas that are at the mouth of the Elwha River.
Oh, nice. All right.
Drop a
That's pretty
teaser.
good. Yeah, that was a good teaser. Like, all right, there's a orca stories coming. Uh, well, thanks so much, Missy. It's really been a pleasure talking with you, and always love leaving a podcast interview hopeful and inspired. And so you definitely helped with that today.
Well, thank you so much, Sam, for inviting me. It's really an honor to be on a podcast with you in particular. So thank you.
Yeah, and I know you were on our kind of sibling podcast a couple of years ago, the Journey of the Universe podcast that Sam King hosts, and so yeah, appreciate you sharing your time with both of us, and definitely looking forward to the orca stories. So I'm making a note for that now. So looking forward to doing it again sometime.
Sounds good.
All right, well, thank you so much, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll be back with some more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.